The air in Charleston always seemed heavy, carrying with it the musk of saltwater marshes and the faint stench of sweat that clung to the city like a curse. In the year 1834, the Whitfield estate stood at the edge of Meeting Street, a three-story mansion of white columns and iron gates. To passers-by, it was a symbol of wealth and order, but to those trapped behind its doors, it was nothing less than a cage. Inside the house, Colonel Thomas Whitfield ruled like a sovereign king. A veteran of wars, his voice carried the bark of command, and his cruelty seemed as natural to him as breathing. His wife Margaret wore her pearls and silks like armor, wielding gossip and disdain as weapons sharper than any blade. They were a family that feasted on the sweat of others, and in the center of their indulgence stood Hannah, the cook. Hannah was not her real name. Years ago, when she was dragged from a Virginia plantation and sold to the Whitfields, her name had been Eliza. But masters had little use for the names their slaves carried from birth. Hannah, they said, was simpler, easier to remember. She had not protested. In silence, she accepted it, but deep inside, Eliza still lived. Eliza remembered. Eliza hated. Each day she rose before dawn, the scent of wood smoke already clinging to her skin as she prepared the fires in the vast kitchen. The room itself was a dungeon of sorts. Low ceilings, soot-stained walls, a heat so oppressive in summer that even breathing felt like punishment. Yet here Hannah found her sanctuary, for the Whitfields rarely set foot inside. They preferred to enjoy the fruits of her labor without glimpsing the sweat that birthed them. In the shadows of the kitchen, Hannah was invisible. That invisibility became her shield. The meals she prepared were works of art. Roasted pheasants glistening with butter, biscuits so soft they melted on the tongue, stews rich with spice that lingered long after the last sip. Guests often marveled at the Whitfields' cook, praising Margaret for her fine hand in the kitchen, though Margaret had never so much as lifted a spoon. Hannah remained a ghost behind every compliment, unseen, unheard, yet essential. But Hannah was more than a cook. She was an observer. She listened when masters drank too much wine and let their tongues wag loose. She watched when overseers stumbled in with blood on their whips. She memorized every cruelty, every sneer, every lash, and each injustice pressed itself into her memory like coal into fire, fueling a slow, simmering rage. Among the enslaved quarters, whispers carried stories like wind, whispers of resistance, tales of men who fled into swamps, of women who poisoned cruel masters in far-off plantations, of uprisings that shook the night. These stories, traded in low voices after the day's labor, became lifelines of hope. One evening, after the work was done and the moon cast pale light over the fields, Hannah sat outside the quarters beside her closest friend, Ruth. Ruth's hands were raw from washing clothes, but her voice carried the strength of someone who refused to break. They say down in Savannah, a woman slipped something bitter into her master's tea. Ruth whispered, eyes darting to ensure no one else was near. Killed him slow. They never knew it was her. Can you imagine? Killing him with nothing but a sip? Hannah didn't answer right away. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers curled tight as though gripping something invisible. Finally, she said softly, "Food goes where no blade can. Into the body. Into the blood." Ruth glanced at her, startled by the steel in Hannah's voice. There was no laughter, no jest. Only quiet certainty. That night, Hannah lay awake on her thin cot, staring at the wooden beams above her. The rhythm of insects outside was broken only by the occasional cry of someone dreaming of freedom they'd never see. She thought of Colonel Whitfield, his booming laugh as he boasted of profits. She thought of Margaret, striking an enslaved girl across the face for spilling wine. She thought of their son Charles, only 13, already mimicking the cruelty of his parents. She thought of every meal she had prepared for them, every slice of bread, every mouthful of stew. And suddenly the kitchen no longer seemed like her prison. It seemed like her weapon. In the weeks that followed, Hannah began to walk the grounds with new eyes. She studied the plants that grew along the marshes and ditches, the glossy green leaves of oleander, the purple blooms of nightshade, the clusters of berries hidden deep in the woods. She watched how animals reacted, which ones fell sick, which ones never rose again. Her mind, sharp as the knives she wielded daily, catalogued it all. She did not rush. Patience was her ally. For years she had stirred pots without suspicion. She would not ruin her shield by acting too soon. Instead, she tested. a faint powder mixed into scraps tossed to the dogs. A crushed leaf slipped into leftover broth given to hogs. She watched their bodies weaken, their breathing shallow. She measured doses with the precision of a scientist, cloaked beneath the guise of a cook. No one suspected. No one even looked at her twice. Then came the night she knew it was time. The Whitfields were hosting a gathering for Colonel Whitfield's allies, a night of wine, speeches, and endless feasting. Hannah stood in the kitchen, sweat rolling down her back, as she stirred a great pot of stew that would be the centerpiece of the table. Her hands moved steadily, gracefully as though this were any other night. But tucked within the layers of spice hidden beneath the flavors of garlic and pepper lay a secret. A powder ground fine, so fine it disappeared into the broth without a trace. Hannah ladled the stew into silver tureens, her face expressionless, her eyes calm. Servants carried it into the dining hall where laughter echoed and glasses clinked. And as she wiped her hands on her apron, Hannah whispered to herself, so quietly no one could hear, "The kitchen is mine." The dining room glowed with the amber light of oil lamps, polished silver reflecting the flickering flames. Colonel Whitfield sat at the head of the table, his voice booming as he toasted to prosperity, to loyalty, to the unshakable foundation of Charleston. Around him, militia officers, merchants, and landowners laughed heartily, their voices thick with arrogance. Hannah did not enter the room. Cooks never did. She remained in the kitchen, listening through the walls. Each burst of laughter felt like a hammer striking her chest, but she held steady, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The stew she had prepared was served steaming hot, its aroma rich and comforting, masking the silent danger hidden within. The guests ladled spoonfuls eagerly, praising its flavor, raising glasses of brandy in Hannah's unseen honor. Their voices grew louder, sloppier, until suddenly the rhythm shifted. At first it was a cough. Sharp, sudden, quickly brushed away. Then another, a groan. A scraping of chairs against the wooden floor. Within minutes, the room filled with the sound of choking, retching, and panicked cries. Colonel Whitfield's booming voice turned to a rasp as he demanded order, but his words broke into wheezing gasps. Hannah sat perfectly still in the kitchen, her face a mask. She could hear the chaos unraveling in the next room, the crash of a wine glass, the frantic scraping of boots, Margaret's shrill scream calling for help. The officers, once full of laughter, now staggered like wounded animals, their bodies betraying them with every poisoned breath. 3 did not see the sunrise. Their bodies were carried out before dawn, pale and still, their deaths blamed on contaminated meat or spoiled wine. Doctors came and went, shaking their heads, muttering about Charleston's humid air and the dangers of summer feasting. Not one cast suspicion on the cook. Hannah returned to her duties the next morning as if nothing had happened. She baked bread, simmered broth, and set her expression into the same calm mask she had worn for years. But inside a storm raged. She had crossed the threshold. She had tasted vengeance, and its flavor was intoxicating. Among the enslaved quarters, whispers spread like wildfire. Servants who had carried the poisoned stew into the dining hall traded glances with Hannah in silence, their eyes wide with both fear and awe. Ruth cornered her one evening, voice low and trembling. "Was it you?" she asked, though the question was more statement than curiosity. Hannah did not answer. She simply met Ruth's eyes, and in that silence the truth was clear. Ruth's lips parted, her breath catching with a mixture of dread and reverence. "God help us," she whispered. "You've done what we all dreamed but never dared." Word traveled quietly, carried from one plantation to the next by enslaved men sent to market, by women sent to wash linens at the riverside. They spoke of the cook who had turned the master's table into his grave. They called her the shadow in the kitchen, the angel of ashes, the poison hand. Her legend began to take root, even as her body remained unseen. But Hannah was not reckless. She understood the danger of suspicion. She did not strike again immediately. Instead, she resumed her duties with precision, ensuring that every meal was perfect, every dish flawless. If the Whitfields feared her food, they did not show it. Margaret even praised her for working through such a dreadful night, her ignorance shielding her from the truth. Still, the deaths had left their mark. Colonel Whitfield grew restless, his once booming confidence rattled by the shadow of uncertainty. He began demanding that others taste his meals before him, sometimes forcing servants to sip his wine or nibble at his bread. His paranoia spread like a sickness, infecting the household, then neighboring estates. Masters across Charleston whispered that the food could not be trusted, that perhaps their own kitchens hid betrayal. Hannah saw it in their eyes when they came to visit, the flicker of fear, the hesitation before lifting a fork. And she knew she had planted something deeper than poison. She had planted doubt. Her work, however, was not hers alone to bear. One night in the dark stretch of the quarters, a young man named Samuel approached her. He was a stable hand, wiry and scarred from years of beatings. His voice was urgent but steady. "They say you know things," he whispered. "Things about plants, about powders. Teach me." Hannah studied him in the moonlight, her expression unreadable. She saw in his eyes the same fire that burned in her own, and she realized then that her act had not been a solitary rebellion. It was the beginning of something larger, something invisible but powerful. So she began to teach. Quietly, cautiously, to those she trusted. She showed Samuel the leaves of oleander, taught Ruth how to mask bitterness with honey, instructed another young woman, Grace, in grinding seeds to dust fine enough to vanish into stew. They met in secret, in marshy clearings or in the quiet of the kitchen after midnight, passing knowledge like sacred scripture. The network grew, an invisible army, armed not with swords but with spoons and cups. Each learned that vengeance could be measured in pinches and sips, in powders and brews. And as the circle expanded, so did the fear among the masters. Soon, across plantations near Charleston, strange deaths began to occur. A master in Goose Creek collapsed after his supper. Another in Mount Pleasant wasted away with a mysterious sickness no doctor could cure. Each death was a whisper of rebellion, a silent strike at the heart of slavery. But with every success came risk. Hannah knew eyes were watching. Overseers grew harsher. Suspicion fell heavy on every servant's shoulders. Kitchens became places of scrutiny, food tasted before meals, slaves beaten on mere suspicion. Yet the more the masters tightened their grip, the more the resistance spread, slipping like smoke through their fingers. One evening, as Hannah stirred a pot over the fire, Ruth entered the kitchen, her face pale. "They're talking about it," she whispered. "The masters. They say there's a woman in Charleston teaching slaves to poison. They're looking." Hannah's hand paused over the spoon. The flames flickered against her face, casting shadows that made her eyes look hollow, haunted. She knew this day would come. She had expected it from the beginning. But the fear in Ruth's voice was not enough to shake her resolve. "Let them look," Hannah said softly, turning back to the pot. "They'll never see what's right before them." And as the stew bubbled, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, Hannah knew the game had only just begun. By autumn of 1834, the Whitfield estate no longer echoed with the same carefree laughter it once had. The family still dined on lavish spreads, but the air around the table was thick with suspicion. Colonel Whitfield had developed a habit of pushing his plate forward, demanding a servant taste it before he would lift a fork. Margaret, once prone to boasting of her cook's skill, now wrung her hands before each meal, her eyes darting between the dishes as though searching for ghosts in the gravy. And all the while, Hannah moved silently through her kitchen, her face calm, her motions precise, her secrets invisible. The paranoia was not confined to the Whitfield household. Across Charleston, rumors rippled through the planter class like waves after a storm. A rice baron in Mount Pleasant fell dead after supper. His doctor blamed fever, though his wife swore it was the food. In Goose Creek, a wealthy widow collapsed at a dinner party, her last words a frantic accusation. "The servants have poisoned me." The city's elite were shaken. At social gatherings, masters whispered nervously, their conversations stripped of bravado. "It's spreading," they muttered, clutching their wine glasses as though they might shatter. "They're using our own kitchens against us." They weren't wrong. The circle Hannah had nurtured was growing, weaving itself like roots beneath the soil. Samuel, the wiry stable hand, carried her lessons north to plantations in Somerville. Grace, the young maid, passed her knowledge to cousins enslaved on estates across the Ashley River. Each person Hannah taught became a branch, and each branch bore fruit. It was not only poison that bound them, but the quiet realization of power. For the first time, enslaved men and women saw fear in their masters' eyes. Not the fear of rebellion in open fields, which could be crushed with guns and whips, but a deeper fear. An invisible enemy, a silent death waiting in every sip and every bite. Hannah watched it unfold with grim satisfaction. She had not sought glory. She had sought justice. But the legend that rose around her gave her a strange kind of power. She became a phantom, a whispered name passed between the enslaved. Some called her the kitchen widow, others, the angel of ashes. Among the quarters, her story was retold by firelight, embroidered with myth until she seemed less woman and more spirit, an avenger cloaked in the smoke of kitchens, striking without being seen. But the legend came with danger. The more her story spread, the more suspicion grew. Overseers prowled kitchens demanding to see ingredients, sniffing at stews as if their noses could detect treachery. Servants were beaten for the smallest mistakes. Trust, already scarce, withered completely. Colonel Whitfield's paranoia deepened into obsession. He ordered Hannah's kitchen searched, her herbs and spices inspected. But the overseers found nothing. Hannah was too careful. The powders she kept were hidden not in jars but in folds of cloth, tucked in hollowed wooden spoons concealed within the walls themselves. She had built her kitchen into a fortress of secrets. Still, she knew the danger was closing in. One evening, as she sat by the fire after preparing supper, Ruth whispered, "You must stop. They are watching too closely now." Hannah's eyes reflected the flames, hard and unyielding. "Stopping will not save us," she replied. "Stopping will only remind them that we are theirs to control. Fear is the only leash we can place on them." Ruth shivered, torn between admiration and dread. She could not deny the truth. The Whitfields, once untouchable, now flinched at shadows. Outside the estate, the circle was taking bolder steps. In swamps and secret clearings, groups of enslaved men and women gathered, exchanging stories of sicknesses and deaths that no overseer could explain. They shared plants plucked from riverbanks, roots dug from marshes, powders ground in stolen mortars. They were cooks, maids, stable hands, even children tasked with serving at tables, all carrying fragments of Hannah's knowledge. Together, they became something larger than themselves. An invisible army. The masters sensed it but could not see it. And that was the beauty of Hannah's creation. It had no face, no leader that could be dragged before a whipping post. To strike down one cook was to leave a dozen others behind, still stirring pots, still carrying powders in the folds of their aprons. In the autumn twilight, Charleston became a city of whispers. Merchants eyed their food with suspicion, planters forced their slaves to eat first, and doctors wrote frantic letters about mysterious illnesses. The air reeked not only of salt and smoke but of dread. And yet, for all the fear, Hannah felt a strange calm. She knew that what she had sown could not be undone, even if she were discovered, even if she were hanged in the town square. Her knowledge had already taken root far beyond her reach. One night, Samuel returned to the Whitfield quarters after weeks away tending to horses on a neighboring plantation. His eyes glowed with fervor as he whispered to Hannah, "They're talking of you in Somerville. They don't call you Hannah. They call you the cook who kills. The masters are trembling, Hannah. They taste their meals as though every bite is their last." Hannah felt a chill creep over her, mingled with grim satisfaction. She had become a ghost in her own lifetime. A story larger than flesh and bone. But legends attract hunters. By winter, word reached the Whitfields of a slave caught in Mount Pleasant, accused of poisoning his master's tea. Under torture, he had screamed names, not true names, but fragments of rumors he had heard. He spoke of a woman in Charleston, a cook who taught others to poison, a woman whose knowledge spread like fire. The planters seized upon the story like starving dogs. To them, the enemy suddenly had a face, a body, a name. In the Whitfield household, Colonel Thomas grew restless, pacing the halls, his eyes narrowing whenever Hannah entered the room. Margaret clutched her pearls tighter when she watched Hannah set the table. The boy, Charles, sneered with cruel delight, muttering that the cook would be next. The circle had grown too powerful to be ignored, and Hannah knew the storm was coming. She sat alone in her kitchen one night, the fire casting long shadows across the stone floor. Her hands rested on her apron, stained with years of labor, years of silence. She could hear the wind outside rattling the shutters, as though the city itself whispered warnings in her ear. But Hannah did not tremble, for she understood something the masters never could. An army built of shadows could never be destroyed. Even if the hunter's torch found her, Even if the rope tightened around her neck, the knowledge she had sown would outlive her. Her kitchen had birthed a revolution, and revolutions do not die easily. And as the clock in the Whitfield hall struck midnight, Hannah whispered to the silence, "Let them come." The winter of 1835 settled over Charleston like a shroud, its damp chill creeping into every brick and bone. The Whitfield estate, once a hub of parties and prosperity, now felt more like a fortress under siege. The grand halls echoed with silence, the dining table spread thinner, the laughter of guests nearly gone. But the fear that gripped the masters only tightened around Hannah's circle. Too many had fallen. Planters, overseers, wealthy widows, and whispers of poisoned food had become cries. Charleston's planter elite demanded answers. They spoke of conspiracies, of an unseen army rising from the kitchens and fields. And then came the betrayal. A boy no older than 17, enslaved on a plantation outside Mount Pleasant, was caught stealing sugar. The punishment was brutal, whipping until flesh peeled, iron shackles clamped on raw skin. Desperate to save himself, he babbled through tears about rumors he had heard, about a cook in Charleston who taught others to kill without knives. He had never met her, but the story poured from his mouth like blood from a wound. The planters seized on the tale. Finally, their phantom had a body. It was not long before Colonel Whitfield's paranoia crystallized into certainty. One night lanterns flared in the quarters, boots thudded heavy on dirt floors, and Hannah was dragged from her bed. Rope bound her wrists, torches cast cruel light across her face. She did not scream. She did not resist. The other enslaved stood frozen, eyes wide with horror. Some turned away, unable to watch. Ruth bit her lip until it bled. Samuel clenched his fist so tight his knuckles cracked. They all knew what was coming. Hannah was locked in a cellar, cold stone pressing against her back, her breath curling in the icy air. Days blurred into nights as she was questioned, threatened, starved. They demanded names of her circle, demanded recipes for her poisons, demanded that she confess. She gave them nothing. When they lashed her, she clenched her teeth until her mouth filled with iron. When they deprived her of food, she let the hunger burn inside like fuel. When they mocked her, calling her witch, devil, monster, she lifted her chin and stared through them as if they were already dead. The Whitfields watched with a mixture of rage and dread. Margaret refused to enter the cellar, insisting the cook's eyes carried curses. Colonel Thomas paced endlessly, barking orders for harsher interrogations. And young Charles, barely into manhood, spat at Hannah through the bars, vowing she would swing for what she's done, and swing she did. On a storm-heavy February evening, the square in Charleston filled with townsfolk. Lanterns glowed against the damp mist, torches sputtered in the wind. A wooden gallows loomed at the center, its rope dangling like a serpent's tongue. The crowd gathered not only to see justice but to smother their own terror. Hannah was marched forward, her wrists bound, her face gaunt, but her posture unbroken. The chains rattled with each step, but her gaze did not waver. She scanned the crowd, past the sneering faces of planters, past the curious stares of townsfolk, and into the shadows where enslaved men and women huddled silently. For them, her eyes softened only for a heartbeat. A minister recited scripture, his words trembling, his voice nearly drowned by the storm winds. Colonel Whitfield stood near the platform, his jaw clenched, his eyes bloodshot. Margaret clutched her shawl, pale and rigid. Charles smirked with cruel satisfaction. The noose was placed around Hannah's neck, the rough hemp scratching her skin. The executioner asked if she had final words. She did. Her voice carried across the square, clear and unshaken. "You may silence me," she said, her eyes never leaving the faces in the crowd. "But you will never silence us. The fire is already lit. You cannot eat without tasting fear. You cannot drink without tasting death. Remember this, your tables are no longer safe." Gasps rippled through the gathering. The minister faltered in his prayer. Even the colonel's hand twitched at his side. Then the rope tightened. Hannah's body fell, her neck snapping with a sickening crack. The storm roared, lightning slashing the sky as if heaven itself bore witness. Her body swung lifelessly, but her words lingered like smoke. The planters hoped her death would smother the terror. But it did the opposite. In the quarters that night, slaves whispered of Hannah as if she were still alive, her spirit passing through the kitchens, guiding their hands. They swore the storm had been her voice, the lightning her final curse. In the weeks that followed, the fear among the masters deepened. Some refused to eat food not prepared by their own wives. Others forced enslaved children to taste every bite before they dared touch it themselves. The paranoia Hannah had sown became a poison far deadlier than any plant. Her circle did not vanish. Samuel carried her knowledge into the swamps, teaching others with the same patience Hannah had shown him. Grace whispered her lessons to cousins in Savannah. Ruth, though broken with grief, passed the story on to younger women, embedding Hannah's name into memory. By the time the Civil War erupted decades later, Hannah's story had spread across the South. She had become legend, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes distorted, but always remembered. Some said she could make men collapse with a touch. Others swore her spirit haunted kitchens, her shadow flickering in the firelight of stoves. But for the enslaved, she was not a ghost. She was a symbol. A woman who, with no weapon but her hands and her knowledge, struck fear into the hearts of those who claimed to own her. A woman who proved that resistance did not always roar with muskets. It could simmer in silence, slip unseen into stews, and leave an empire trembling. Even long after Charleston's chains were broken, when freedom was finally declared, her name lived on. Mothers told their children the tale of the cook who fought with fire and spoon. Elders whispered her courage into the ears of the next generation. And every time a master lifted a fork with hesitation, every time a mistress sniffed her wine before sipping, it was Hannah's invisible hand at their table. Her body had died on the gallows, but her legacy lingered, not as a monster, not as a criminal, but as the spark that lit an invisible revolution.